Hello and welcome to Varnblog. And today I'm here with Rob Walker, ecotherapist, former academic, and the author of Radical Young, which is a book coming out, already out. I actually should know this, but I don't know.
Out in about 2 weeks' time, towards the end of this month.
Oh, okay. So yeah.
I got my first copy yesterday, so it exists. I can confirm it exists.
Coming out from Revo Press, and for full disclosure, I also work with Revo. I am an author there, releasing a book with Daniel Tutt, which will come out in June in theory, although I don't know for sure. The physical books I don't yet have. I'm under contract to write another book for Revo as well on politics in general, which I have been under contract for 3 years. And
I know those contracts.
had changed the co-author twice. And anyway,
I'm glad to hear that. Glad it's not only me that has books limping on.
Oh, I'm sort of infamous for getting offers to write books and getting them about 150 pages done, and then realizing that I gave myself like way too much scope and I need to write 5 volumes, and the publisher's just going to say no, and I'll just stop. Which is not good for your career. But anyway, so yeah, Rob and I share press. And we were talking off air about my instinctual distrust of psychoanalysis, which has lessened slightly due to my engagements with Daniel Tutt and a few other people in the Lacanian sphere, but only slightly.
Well, tell me about that. What describe it?
The description that I have a knee-jerk reaction to psychological approaches to politics in particular. When it comes to the therapeutic, I actually do tend to favor things that are one could saw as post-psychoanalytic or expansions of psychoanalysis, as opposed to just like, say, drug therapy. Because they all don't have a lot of reproducibility when it comes to like modern science standards. I also have tended to, for me, and it does come up in my book, I saw weird assumptions being projected anthropologically and sociologically from people taking too orthodox a Freudian or Lacanian psychoanalytic stance. And by that, I specifically think about Christopher Lasch, who took every single word Freud wrote on the family literally and even biologically, which can't stand any real scrutiny, scientifically speaking. But I have been interested in psychoanalysis as a space that opens up a problem in what we might call like the Marxist radical imagination, and it's one that I think everybody fills up to some degree with, even without thinking, and that is the Marxist way of viewing political economy is concerned with aggregates turning into collectives. It doesn't really deal with the way that interfaces with individual human minds. Even though Marx does have like basically some kind of emergent Hegelian notion of concepts and reification in the human mind, he actually doesn't really deal with psychology at all. Because it's always socially mediated. And I actually do think it's a problem that we substitute all kinds of shit for Marxism. Like if you look at the various schools of Marxism, how we deal with the individual mind problem is something that I think actually defines a lot of the different schools of Marxism, even though they're often not framed that way, whether it's world systems or political Marxism or analytical Marxism or Marxo-Freudianism or even traditional Marxism-Leninism. They all have certain problems. I mean, the biggest one being that even though Marx didn't think this way, a lot of Marxists in the early 20th century basically had behaviorist assumptions about class formation.
Yeah.
And they were almost blank slatist on how people exist. And, you know, Marx doesn't actually believe that, but outside of his initial stuff on species being, he doesn't really address it ever. So,
yeah. And I think that, you know, that's where, I mean, to answer a few of the different points that you just made, but I suppose for me, the point of writing this book was to try and kind of, like you were saying, the person who'd sort of just applied all of Freud's theories. I wanted to look at Jung and kind of queer the hell out of it. Like this stuff, let's like make this stuff appropriate for now because there's a lot wrong with it. And then just and to, well, as I said in the book, it's sort of I mean, this is more a summary than in the book, but my problem with psychoanalysis is that it leads to this kind of this inevitable individualism, and you know, so it's all well and good, you know, going to psychoanalysis to be better, to recover from whatever it is that you're struggling with. But then what? And I feel like the next step is not, it's like to be better so that you can then act better. And that bit is missing, it seems to me. It tends to be missing. And so that was what I was trying to kind of tease out here with the book.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it makes sense because act better is always act better in accordance with what or to do what. Like, like there's always a second part of that question, right? Like, and I mean, we can get into, you know, the critiques to the therapeutic, which range from Phil Reef and Bung Cho Han to whatever. I mean, David Smalls, Mark Fisher. I liked your book because it doesn't quite fall into the problem that I often saw with Fisher, which was like this almost eschatological view of social democracy that you get in the late Fisher, where like beginnings to deal with the social problems will also help us deal with our mental alienation and almost one-to-one, which to me puts such a personal stake on the success of politicians, frankly.
Well, if we put all of our recovery into politics, we're fucked, basically, aren't we?
Yeah.
Like that's when, you know, we need something more to help us, you know, get through this.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, you know, it's increasingly not too much of a stretch to say, like, what would you say to someone on the left in Germany in 1938? Like, they need to find a way to just manage to get through that. Like, there's the doing the politics, but there's just like survival and mental health is an aspect of that.
Well, that's actually a key thing I was thinking about when I was reading your book, because I think in both our countries, we've seen a left seemingly ascendant and yet also in its ascendancy actually be more powerless than you thought it could be.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I literally had pain going back and reading Marx writing about Syriza and Corbyn in like 2013, 2014, 2015.
Yeah.
Because it strikes you as so naive and you feel like you're just watching a tragedy unfold.
Yeah. But I think there's and this is kind of, I don't know, immediately leaping into kind of tin hat territory here, but I think it's necessary, is that my PhD, which I wrote I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, was looking at the emergence of counter-extremism policies, or the emergence of street. It was specifically looking at the word extremism and how that's emerged over time as a tool of governmentality. And so through that, I was kind of getting myself sort of ferreting around, getting myself into meetings at the Home Office in London, looking at through documentation and stuff. And I had a few like really shocking moments at the time, because it was right at the time of the ascendancy of Corbyn. And the thing that really was a real gut punch was finding connections that no journalists have ever dared touch, because it just sort of was too much of a political hot potato at the time. But that some of the accusations of the first accusations, or the initial accusations of anti-Semitism against Jeremy Corbyn, were coming from very close to the Home Office. And I had this kind of dawning realization when I was having this meeting with someone at the Home Office, that those accusations were coming from the heart of the state. And that was kind of terrifying. So I think that kind of, I want to kind of temper that accusation of naivety for people who were kind of seeing this great sort of flourishing at the time, because I think there were kind of dark forces at play that are just never going to let the left rise.
Well, I mean, I both kind of agree with that, but then I think my answer to that has always been, this is why you don't play their game.
Yeah.
Because you literally cannot win. But as far as what that means, though, people often
so the naivety comes from them trying to progress through as a political party through the system as is designed against them.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we can see this even more with like Syriza, which gave itself an impossible task that helped the Troika, actually, if we're completely honest. But at a certain point, the Troika's revenge on Greece would have been so bad that maybe the disaster thing that Syriza threatened should have just been done anyway.
Yeah.
But that, I mean, all their MMT-based hopes that Greece could like separate, do a Grexit, and then run an internal economy were basically based on a production apparatus that doesn't exist in Greece currently.
Yeah.
And
they had speaking to that point. Have you heard Yanis Varoufakis talking about them trying to recreate the currency?
Yeah,
they couldn't even produce the currency. Like that was the fundamental stumbling block.
I mean, Varoufakis is fascinating to me, but you probably don't know my stances on that. I tend to admire him for being the one person in Syriza who seemed to actually realize that they were going to have to take a principled stand. At least, I shouldn't say one person. One person in Syriza with power.
Yeah.
But I also tend to think, but you should have known this was going to happen.
Yeah.
It was exactly what I had a conversation with the post-Keynesian academic Steve Keen on an obscure podcast. I think it was like in 2013 when I was living in Mexico. And I remember telling him, like, well, what do you do if you can't get the leverage to buy anything to build a productive apparatus in Greece? You don't even have the way to print a stable currency. And yet, that if you play hardball and can't actually deliver on your threat, the repercussions are going to be worse. And I pretty much didn't get an answer. The answer was they won't let that happen, or currency magic will fix things. And I was actually pretty interested in that. And when it comes to Corbyn, you probably also, I mean, like, you're probably not super familiar. I have been a skeptic of Corbyn's policies in so much that they seem to be based on returning to a state of labor that not having an empire and being an island would be very hard to do.
Yeah.
But I also take seriously that there was a great internal effort to the British state to undermine him. Now, unfortunately, he has not helped with the current party shenanigans. It's your party or our party. I always can't remember.
Your party. I mean, it's a tragedy what happened with that. Just such a, I mean, just stupid, and I don't know. It just shouldn't have happened. That shouldn't have happened at all.
Yeah. So anyway, that's not the course.
I used to many years ago, I was a school teacher in North London, and I was the union rep for my school, and the school was on the same street as Corbyn lived on, and so he was our local member of parliament.
Oh, good.
And he was extraordinary at the time. We were going through like a rough. There was some quite serious corruption, and we basically had a head teacher who, well, anyway, there was some quite serious corruption in the school, the school management that involved us having to have involved in various bits of industrial action, including like a strike just for the school and stuff like that. And I was constantly in negotiations with the local council as the union rep. And I mean, this is totally by the by to the broader politics, but he was extraordinary. This was before there was any sniff of him becoming the leader of the Labour Party. He was just a local politician, and he'd come to these meetings at like until 10, 11 at night, regularly, just as kind of to support me doing this union work. Just given that he was kind of doing his full-time job, being in Parliament all day, and then he comes straight to that and stuff, and it was kind of his energy for doing local politics was extraordinary. And obviously, the big criticism is always, oh, well, he was a great local politician, but he could never run a party, etc., etc. But I don't know about that, but he was quite a pretty extraordinary man.
I don't know. I mean, to sing Corbyn's praises a little bit, I was not mocking Labour during the Corbyn period as I am mocking Labour during the Starmer period. Like,
it's awful now.
Yeah.
I don't think that I mean, I was writing about this long before Starmer was even leader of the party, that forever he's been a corporate or an establishment entryist. He is an entryist. I don't think there's any way you can see him as anything other than that. And
go ahead.
Well, no, and he's achieved. He's achieved exactly what is required of him. He's destroyed the Labour Party. For the last couple of elections, he's left the door open to the Tories, or it's going to be Labour, neither of which is any different from the other. Like, it's a perfect setup.
I mean, I was about to say, or it could even be reform. I mean, it's I am, as a perpetual watcher of British politics, it's been a kind of bleak time, but I've actually used, sadly, your nation as part of the predictions of the future of ours.
Right. Go on.
Because I'm like, we've done many of the same things, and except the British situation is tragic on the scale of Britain. And which is not to diminish it, but it is mostly the final bounce from that fall from empire. Whereas we are doing the same thing, but we're the empire. And for all that I often give the English shit, and I do, but I have been very much on the like, you handled this imperial decline things with slightly more grace for a while than we did. We immediately went into the embarrassing part. Like I can't, honestly, since we achieved, unipolarity for all of a decade, we have been nothing but embarrassing ourselves and destroying our own mechanisms of power. So,
but I think Britain has, does exactly the same. We just do it slightly more subtly.
Yeah, you do it subtle. Well, I would say it was more subtle till recently.
Yes, yeah.
I will say, like, Starmer flirting with undoing parts of the Magna Carta was not even on my bucket list of things I might see. So, and the other thing that we've seen with the UK that we're going to have to deal with here, is even if the Democrats come back to power, we are going to be dealing with a managed economic decline and a K-shaped economy.
Yeah.
And New York, where Mamdani is, has the same pitfalls as London. It's totally tied into the financial infrastructure, which can be moved overnight, as opposed to... And yes, it doesn't often get moved overnight, but, London reminds us that it can. Pretty easily in ways it's harder to do than when you're moving massive factories around. So
the whole thing of, like, the right in the UK, where they hang their whole economic policy on the City of London, and apart from just basically being a mental thing to do, but the thing that they always go on about, on all parties in the UK go on about this, is they talk about wanting to make London Singapore on Thames, and what they miss there is that in Singapore you've got, like, the rest of the state works. Like, they've got social housing, they've got healthcare, they've got education that works, they've got all of these things. For all of the negatives about Singapore, there's a whole load of other stuff around their financial economy that works, and they just use it as a kind of, I don't know, it's the thing that really frustrates me with politicians over here when they talk about that it's just missing all of the fundamentals that add on to that enable it to work.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's actually one of the things I pointed out about Singapore, Korea before 1982, the Republic of Korea, not North Korea, is that these were Leninist capitalist countries that also were tolerant of social welfare systems as long as they could make billionaires, but they were willing to make that trade-off with social peace. And it does not seem like in the English-speaking world our elites are willing to make any fucking trade-offs for social peace.
Well, my equivalent of those economies that I know is my wife was born Malaysian and now naturalized British, and so I spent a fair bit of time in Malaysia. And in Malaysia, they have that thing where it's presented, when you speak to a Malaysian, it's presented as this kind of hyper-capitalist economy. But actually, when you start digging down, it's a planned economy. It's totally a planned economy. They've got all their kind of nationalized companies that they set up. They've got their 30-year plan to do this, that, and the other. It's all planned.
Yeah. Well, I've actually said this to make people uncomfortable, but I'm like, there's not that huge of a difference between what we've seen in China post-Deng and what we've seen in Singapore and the Republic of Korea, at least in the Republic of Korea until aughts neoliberalization happened, and Singapore didn't do that. So, and I've also pointed out that they explicitly modeled their economic development on the Soviet Union, even though they were anti-communists. So, explicitly down to 5-year plans. Like, it's
well, I mean, that's what happened in Malaysia. They had the 20-year plan, and then it went so well they said, well, we're going to have a 30-year plan. Like, everyone talks about the 10-year plan, the 20-year plan, the 30-year plan. Like, it's totally in the open to be discussed.
Yeah, I mean, so there is this, I mean, to maybe turn a little bit to the book, but there is this way in which almost dialectically like I was reading Vivek Chibber saying that socialists need to abandon a planned economy, and I was like, I don't know why you think that, because capitalists don't.
Yeah.
Like, just straight up, they don't. Particularly now, since everything's rent seeking. So it's these AI things are definitely centrally planned economic moves. They're not happening off of the freedom of the market or whatever bullshit you want to tell yourself.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I do think though that we can talk about Jung a little bit. The radical Jung was interesting to me because in America we associate Jung, and I think this is new actually.
Yeah.
We associate him with reactionaries for two reasons.
Yeah.
Weird right-wing occultists sometimes like him.
Yeah.
And Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
I find that interesting. I know Jung's politics are actually very hard to pin down. So I wanted to talk to you a little about that, because you don't just shy away. It's not just that you're not shying away from Jung. You're also not shying away from some of the weirder, more esoteric / Gnostic elements of Jung.
Yeah. I mean, that's I've fully gone. I mean, I've purposely gone into that. I think just to your first point about left and right, something that I was thinking about earlier today. I was just daydreaming about it, and I can't remember who was talking about this the other day, but a lot within. So I bring in psychedelics at the end of the book, and within kind of the world of psychedelics, there can be this naive feeling for some people that, oh, like, get everyone taking acid and then everyone's going to become these kind of hippies and leftists, and it's all going to be great, which is clearly bullshit. Like, if you're a fascist and you start taking psychedelics, you're going to become more fascist. Like, you're going to see what you want to see, and so I suppose there's probably a bit of that going on with Jung, with the right, enjoying it. And I think it's just in the introduction to it, when I talk about Jordan Peterson and how he says, I found a couple of examples of him saying it on on podcasts and things, where he said that Jung is just for a small number of people who have this experience, this life-changing experience, where they go through individuation, which is discovering different parts of your psyche, and it's just for a small number of people. And he's referring to himself, and I think that move, which, because Jung is not about that at all. Jung is about this is about everyone's experience. He calls it immediate experience, to have these kind of visionary experiences, whether they be through your dreams or through psychotic states or whatever else. That everyone is open to that immediate experience. And when you've got someone like Jordan Peterson saying, "Oh, this is only for a select few," that's immediately tending towards fascism, because you've then got this kind of illuminated, cadre of people who are better than everyone else, essentially. So I kind of immediately take aim at that. And I think that move in itself maybe dulls slightly the attachment of the right, because if this is for everyone.
I think that's. I mean, if I'm honest with you, since I've studied a lot of right-wing occultist figures for reasons, including spending a lot of my 20s in the paleo-conservative right myself. Jung was often treated as a gateway drug to people like Evola and Guénon. And that the actual goal was to get you into these esoteric elitist circles.
Okay.
And Jung was like the normie entrance that you could understand through psychology. It was less alienating than, I don't know, whatever Crowley was onto, or trying to just immediately go to Julius Evola and against the modern world, because it's not going to make any sense to most people. And so I tended to frame Jung that way as well, myself, until I started reading him. And then I was like, I can't make head or tails out of this guy's politics, actually. Like, it's not. it sure as hell isn't Jordan Peterson's politics. That was immediately clear to me. Like,
yeah,
like Jung's views on gender are way different than right-wing Jungian's views on gender.
Yeah, well,
So,
I mean, I pick up on that in the book, and I think I mean, what I say in the book is it's so Jung's ideas on gender are essentially that I mean, it's obviously because of his time, it's like non-gender critical. So you're born a man or you're born a woman, and you are the embodiment of, as a man, of logos, kind of logic and etc., or as a woman, the embodiment of eros, of romance and emotions and everything like that. And then you get to this point in your life where you discover the other gendered side of yourself, and the completeness is to have those two gendered sides, which I've kind of found interesting, because when I was reading into kind of indigenous accounts of gender, there tends to be that's the thing that denotes elderhood, is to appreciate those two sides of yourself. But I think it's quite important with what I've suggested in Jung is that that whole equation can exist as long as you remove that attachment to biological gender at the start. So, for example, I've got trans friends who have basically done that process in reverse, because they just happen to be someone who's born biologically a man maybe is the embodiment of eros, their psyche is the embodiment of eros when they're growing up, and vice versa. So I think that kind of initial assertion of Jung's on gender is something that we can then kind of, with our current perspective and current understanding of gender, we can handle more lightly and a bit more, see it as more fluid, as we tend to with gender anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I do find it interesting how the way gender is both essentialized and de-essentialized in Jung is it seems both ancient and slightly progressive. I mean, like, if it's not just in I mean, you see this in indigenous accounts, you see it in early European accounts too, if you like reading Plato or any of the cosmic egg writings about the origins of humanity, and you have them as a unified whole, almost hermaphroditic being that is split, and then part of your understanding is to come to that back together. And even in the ancient Greek, it wasn't even particularly, the reconciliation of the opposites was not always even of two people of opposite sex. It was all kinds of combinations. So I do find that interesting, and I do think that really cuts against some of the stranger essentialism you get out of Jordan Peterson.
Because of course the original like that Jungian description of gender that I gave you is ripe for someone like Jordan Peterson to use it to say to someone who presents as trans or whatever, well, you've obviously not integrated these different aspects of your psyche, and therefore essentially to accuse someone of being like immature or broken or something, which is essentially what he's doing all the time. And so it's kind of ripe to be used for that. And I think that's the sort of danger with it, as I was saying. Like it certainly, like any Jung, I think you can apply it to right-wing ends easily.
Yeah, very easily. But I guess, I do like the idea that maybe we shouldn't just give up all this, what we might say, socially libidinal and symbolic ways of thinking. And the thing that Jung has that is different from Freud is that Jung's understanding of these social callings are much broader than just the reproduction of the immediate family. It's not that's not there, but that's not what he doesn't read the entire world as a replication of bourgeois family life, and Freud very much does. To be frank. I wanted to get into a couple of things as a kind of way of talking about your book, because you get into immediately Gnostic and Gnosis, which are in both religious studies and in psychology two of the most fraught terms that exist. I mean, if you get into Gnostic studies, I was just reading a book called The Gnostic World that, like, the first chapter is, does this concept even make any sense? Like, in the groups that used it. Because in these groups, and I wanted to bring this up, talking to you about the way you talk about it in your book. Gnostic both has an elitist and a non-elitist meaning. So in some ways and in some sects, it is immanent to all being. And in other sects, it is something that is exclusive to people who are born to know it. And weirdly, when you get introduced to like both in popular culture and in occult culture, it's the second form of Gnosticism you're usually introduced to, which is this elite, cognitive elite or spiritually elite idea that there's something ungraspable that enables you to have this knowledge. But when you actually dig into the various quote unquote Gnostic texts, you see a wide variety on how widespread or broad it actually is.
I mean, so I was obviously reading a lot of Jung stuff on Gnosticism, and then I kind of spent a lot of time with the Nag Hammadi scriptures, which are these that were discovered fairly recently, and I don't know,
lots of Plato in there. I have that exact edition of the book, but go ahead.
There's lots of Plato in there, and I think a reason for me kind of alighting on Jung was he basically says that he was brought up in a good Catholic family, but just he found church to be just a totally spiritually dead experience, whereas he'd go outside and look up at the mountains and was filled with awe and wonder, and there was kind of more going on there. And similarly, I was brought up. My dad was a vicar, and so I was brought up in a Protestant family as a Christian, and I don't know. I suppose I felt reading Jung and then reading the Nag Hammadi scriptures a bit like when I first read Max Weber on the Protestant aesthetic. It was like, oh, now I understand why all these stories were being pushed in church. Like it makes sense now, and the way that Jung talks about actually, we're all open to these immediate experiences, which is your former definition of Gnosticism, and also, like, I suppose there was a kind of inevitability that this also comes from my own individual experience of Gnosticism, for want of a better word, which is, I've centered the book around this kind of these poems that emerge in my dreams, and it was kind of, for me, this was right on cue. In my early 40s, I suddenly started remembering my dreams, and I was able to find meaning in them through reading Jung, it kind of went deeper than that, actually. That when I you've read a bit of some of the Gnostic Gospels, but they talk about, they keep coming to this thing, the mystery of the bridal chamber. And there's this thing, there's this thing about the mystery of the, and you read through the Gnostic Gospels, and it's like they keep referring to it, but like, what the hell is that? Like, what are you on about? And I meditate quite a lot. I meditate morning and evening, and I had a period, I guess it was around when I was starting to write the book, maybe it came just before it. Anyway, I suppose it sort of spurred on the book, but where if I had a difficult conundrum, if I had something, if you've got something that you are worried about or you're anxious about, it's about establishing, and this is quite Jungian, but for me, I found that if I could establish that anxiety was coming because there was one part of my psyche that wanted to do one thing, another part of my psyche that wanted to do another thing. And if I could really disaggregate those two aspects of my psyche so that I knew that one wants to do that thing, that one wants to do that thing, and I then meditated, I had a few times where I got this full, it was like a psychedelic experience, but I was totally sober, of like white light, all love kind of experience of that, which to my mind seems to be, I think now, what they're talking about, the mystery of the bridal chamber. And I suppose I'm telling that story to say that this book for me comes from a point of my own immediate experience, a very, very kind of personal experience of like, there is a value and I'm going to say and a reality to the kind of symbolism that occurs in dreams and in waking life through synchronicity, that I certainly have found hugely guiding. And also, as I say in the book, this comes off the back of me being involved in quite activist politics for the last kind of decade or so, and getting really burnt out, kind of dangerously burnt out, and talking to Mike about this as well, of being, I think there's a lot of people on the left who are burnt out, particularly at the moment, and we need to find a way to navigate through that, and it pushed that my kind of activist work had kind of pushed me to a point of almost suicidal depression, and I had to find a way to get through that. And then particularly, I talk about this in the introduction, reading, there are more and more books coming out from particularly climate activists, like young climate activists who've found themselves in kind of terrible mental health struggles. And, we need to figure out how to navigate that, because, without having a toolkit to understand how to navigate through that, like more and more people are going to be lost from activist politics. And that was the other point of that, was that like the psychotherapeutic solution to that is basically to retreat from activist politics and work on your individual mental health. And I wasn't comfortable with that as a solution. I wanted to see, like, can we do this and then carry on? And there aren't any like massive answers to that in the book, but I think it's worth kind of just hanging on to that question of what do we do with this once, if we can find, health or whatever it is, or recovery, what do we do with that?
Oh, there's a lot to pull apart there. I'm also stepping down actually this month as a high school teacher union rep. So I've done that job.
Well done.
I've done it for 6 years actually.
Yeah.
And I also did the unfortunate teacher mercenary world tour, which sounds like a joke, but from 2009 to 2017, I traveled the world teaching at first colleges and then at elite IB high schools.
Okay. Yeah. I've got friends doing that.
And since as a servant of elites, but since I went to where there was the most money to be leveraged at a time, I tended to end up in places that were dangerous. So I ended up in Egypt during the Counter-Revolution and Mexico during the Zeta-Sinaloa cartel war. Nice. And so not only did I get burnout, I gave myself massive post-traumatic stress disorder aggravations. I already had PTSD before I did any of this, but like now I have it like soldier level bad. And the other thing that I've done, similar to you, although I don't come from a Protestant background, I come from a Catholic and a secular Jewish background. And my father did the thing that he jumped religions and for a while was a Buddhist. So I was actually exposed to relatively orthodox Theravada Buddhism as like a teenager. So I have used those kinds of religious-esque experiences to like maintain some level of sanity. And I also meditate semi-regularly. I read a lot of religious texts, which surprises people for, someone who will, and when it comes to politics or philosophy, I basically am a materialist, but when it comes to how we actually live, I actually just like it I don't find it particularly psychologically helpful. So, and I've thought a lot about this because I was talking to someone the other day and I was like, look, the DSA has 105,000 people in it, right? But for every one DSAer I meet, now that I'm in the organization, I also meet 7 burnt out ex-DSAers of various varieties. For some of them political, some of them getting mad at the entryism, some of them just burn out. They just see it as a time suck. And I've also seen a lot of people do something that I think is personally destructive, which is to go into politics as a way of fulfilling social needs by, and I think at first, because politics is inherently social, it can help you start to get out of your own head, but the area of the social that interfacing with political power brings about is, like you were implying, anyone's ever dealt with the state has their I'm always, when we talk about like conspiracy theories on the left or whatever, I'm always like, well, how do I draw the line? Because I don't want to, I think a lot of this Alex Jones level, the Richie baby shit is absurd.
Yeah.
But also, it's not nothing that there's elite conspiracies that exist and that they take advantage of people and abuse their power and even set up the most horrific cabals of shit that we could metaphorically see as child sacrifice for sure.
That's interesting actually. Yes, if you were to see all the Alex Jones shit as mythological, it works.
I mean, in this weird way. I mean, like I've actually pointed out, like some of the right-wing talking points are things that if you don't take them literally, which they inevitably do, they actually are critiques of both our current governmentality and capitalism. But because they have literalized them, they actually spare capitalism and the state from the full implications of what they're saying. Which is this fascinating. It's a fascinating problem that leads to all kinds of contradictions that don't bother these right wingers at all. They bother like liberals who are trying to make sense of them, but it doesn't bother. Like Alex Jones does not lose sleep that he is both siding with the deep state a lot of the time now, but also like thinks they're a baby sacrificing cabal that are literally ran by the devil, but also his own people are implicated. I don't think he thinks about that all that much, period. Like,
but it's interesting though that he winds himself up and then lets this stuff out. He's to put a Jungian lens on it, he's projecting his immediate experience, isn't he? This is as the world as he sees it, and he's just splurging it out with no filter.
Oh yeah, that's almost I mean, there is an almost automatic writing level.
He's not doing the thing. He's not reading the symbols. He's just regurgitating them. Right.
And that's, I mean, that's interesting. It's interesting to me to think about a lot of these areas where, like, people will talk about this and they'll say like, oh, we need to pick some kind of populist coalition with Tucker Carlson or whatever. And I'm like, that's absurd. But there is something that they're speaking to that we should acknowledge and expand without giving into their literal everything's run by Satan way of viewing the world. And I know that's hard, and I know that as a Marxist, part of me wants to lean into this very scientific worldview that scones all that, but I can tell you that weirdly, that doesn't seem scientifically viable. That like
Yeah.
I can't find a society that actually does that, including secular ones. So,
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you. I mean, we could talk about the first chapter, the horror and the call to adventure, a little bit. Maybe go through this. Where I think we're going to alternate between systemic discussion of the book and jumping around, and we're already 15 minutes in. But but I wanted to talk to you about like the way you see unconscious psychological projections fueling a lot of modern politics from the weird libidinal economy around our like executive leaders, be they Trump or Starmer or whoever. Boris Johnson for you guys back when the Tories were in charge. But also how it plays into the way we view conflicts and warfare that we don't participate in, but know is happening in our name and often see indirectly in our society. Like, how do these psychological projections play upon that?
Well, I mean, so you've asked a lot there. I mean, one of the things I talk about, and well, I think there's so many bits to pick up on. I think one of the points that I talk about is this Jung's idea, and I can never pronounce it right, but of an enantrodromia, which is where we basically end up, if you oppose someone, you end up fueling their position. Like people just dig their heels in, and I think in that's obviously been kind of catalyzed by social media, and so there's that going on, which I think we need to be aware of, because that's happening at every level of politics. That's happening, like at a macro level, that's happening between like the USA and Iran at the moment. Like those two societies are very different, and that kind of opposition not leading anywhere positive for anyone, and needing and then the sort of I talk a lot about the horror and the as we've all experienced through social media of seeing horrific things coming out of Gaza and wherever else, and being projected straight into our faces from our phones, and that's not historically, that's not normal to be witness to these horrific things all the time. And I don't think we are currently prepared to deal with it, because you've got these algorithms that are not thinking in the way that we think. The algorithms are looking at are mapping our emotional reactions to things, and they have been doing that for years. So the algorithm has got a really good handle on our deep psychology. Like it knows what's going to trigger us, and it then projects the images that it knows are going to trigger us the most to us, and we react in a predictable manner that the algorithm can predict and manipulate. And we're doing a lot of our politics online, and so we need to somehow gain control of that situation, because we're not in control of that situation. And I suppose that's where this for me, why particularly deep psychology, as we're talking about here, is so important, because the algorithm knows our deep psychology better than we know ourselves. And I don't know if it's possible, but I certainly know that it helps. And I know from my own experience that it can help to engage in our deep psychology, to help us to not react to this stuff in an unthinking way, which is what we're doing otherwise. So I think that's an aspect of it which is hugely important. And then this other bit of that you were saying about how, I think there's a quote in the book, isn't there, about how he's saying, and it, obviously this carries on playing out today, but how few people see the wars that are going on between countries as an unmitigated psychological disaster. And I don't think I actually wrote about this. I wrote about it extensively in my last book. I don't think I wrote about it in this book, but Gregory Bateson wrote about schismogenesis, which is his idea. And then David Graeber wrote about it with David Wengrow in his lost book. They used a lot about schismogenesis, but schismogenesis being, again, it's kind of on a it can happen on an interpersonal level, or it can happen at a nation state level. That again, as I said before, that one country opposes another, the other one dictates, and it's just this process of escalation that becomes inevitable. And I think that, so as individual political agents, I think it's really important that we have a better understanding of our deep psychology, so that we can understand how we're acting. Not even about acting better or worse, but we just understand how we're acting. Because I think without kind of a lot of introspection, we don't understand how we're acting. And then the other, I mean, you talked about Starmer and Boris Johnson. I'm kind of more interested in, I think people like Starmer and Boris Johnson, I'm not that interested in them psychologically. I think they're just paid agents. They've got, but I am interested in our increasingly powerful oligarchs, kind of Elon Musk and the rest of them, and particularly, I mean, it'll show in the bits that I'm writing about Musk, that I was writing this when he was kind of taking a chainsaw to the American state with his Doge initiative, and continues. He and other oligarchs, they sort of talk disparagingly about anyone who is. They basically they take aim at anyone who is from an unprivileged minority, and then they say they're really privileged. That seems to be like the general vibe that comes out of them, and it's the same in the UK here. We've just had this. There's been a massive fascist march in London today, and that's their whole thing is talking about DEI and how all these people who are massively privileged, and in this country it's that migrants are being put up, or refugees are being put up in hotel rooms. It doesn't matter that you've got like 12 of them crammed into a hotel room, but that's used as, that these people are saying that therefore these people are massively privileged. And the thing I suggest in the book about those accusations of privilege, particularly coming from the oligarchs, is that I think that privilege is their shadow. Like if someone like Elon Musk was to really engage with how privileged he is, like how much wealth he's got, what that wealth could achieve, he couldn't cope with it. He couldn't maintain his social position. He couldn't maintain his wealth if he was to really engage with that. And so therefore they have this shadow of their privilege, which means that they attack anyone. So they attack anyone who hasn't got privilege, and they accuse them of being privileged. And I don't know, we can't. I don't know. Elon Musk isn't going to read my book and suddenly change his mind. He's not going to read my book anyway. But I think it's helpful to understand that, because at least understanding where it's coming from is a start. Again, I don't have solutions, but I think it's important that we have an understanding of why people are acting in the way they're acting.
Well, the thing about the oligarchs is actually fascinating to me. I mean, one of the things that we've seen with these oligarchs, particularly ones with more fascist politics, is that they're immigrants in the societies that they're working out of. Musk is not from here.
Yeah.
They
half of them are from apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say him and Thiel are. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. They often don't even plan on living here. Like Thiel's got his compound in New Zealand. Zuckerberg's got his super bunker in Hawaii.
And they all want to go to space.
Yeah, and they all want to go to space, which they're not going to get to go, but whatever.
Yeah.
They might, but it probably won't work out super well for them. But it's clear that they imagine that the exploited, oppressed, and marginalized are actually somehow not, because that's a self-defense mechanism against what the mass towards wealth. And honestly, if we're talking about this set of oligarchs, even though some of them do have some legitimate technical skills, all of them were empowered by government policy. They are not they're not even the same kind of people as the last round of mega oligarchs we got in the United States during the, the robber barons period.
Yeah.
Some of whom really did come from nothing.
Yeah.
And some of whom really did get relatively rich before they started getting integrated into the government and getting more money from that. Although they all did that too. But these tech oligarchs have, like, why is Elon Musk the richest man in the world? It's because Obama gave SpaceX a contract, and that's seriously the main reason. Thanks, Obama. And there's more than a little bit of an irony of these people who are totally integrated. I mean, Alex Karp, Elon Musk, to a lesser degree Bezos and Zuckerberg, but they've all tried to become existentially tied to the security state in ways that should be very alarming, because it's like, okay, so Starlink is tied into multiple government security apparatus in a way that during the Cold War, even some real sketchy figures like Robert Maxwell could not completely achieve. I wanted to ask you about, like, how does this play into in your second chapter? You talk about Gotterdammerung syndrome, and you particularly talk about Kim Stanley Robinson talking about it. How does that tie into what you're talking about with this privileged shadow stuff that you're seeing with these oligarchs?
Well, so the Gotterdammerung syndrome, that comes from Kim Stanley Robinson's book. What is it? The Ministry of the Future. And he suggests that, what is it? He says that mostly powerful men, some women, but mostly men, who feel that their privileged position is under attack, and they would rather destroy the world than see that privilege lost. And I think that's my launch pad for this idea of privilege as a shadow. And I think we've got, I think that's in many ways, it's therefore, it totally fits with this kind of trajectory for Thiel and Musk, at least from apartheid South Africa. Like, if they can't have their white supremacy, then like the gloves are off for the rest of the world, basically.
Right. And they were okay with progressive stuff as long as they could still have secretly their white supremacy. And now that they can't have that, they've turned, and in ways that sometimes, I mean, it is dangerous to psychologize individuals who you don't know, but it does seem like some of it just comes down to some of these oligarchs felt slighted by various Democratic administrations. And even though, ironically, all of them, even Thiel, became wealthy off of Democratic Party policies. Like, that's, they all were beneficiaries of the Obama recovery. They were all given, all of them have sweet deal government contracts. They've all been able to leverage neoliberalism and protections to get monopsony pricing power, et cetera, et cetera. And now they're just interested in well, there's two things they seem to be interested in. One seems to be getting so tied into the defense state that you cannot get that their AI debacle, which shows no sign of actually being profitable beyond NVIDIA chips, will be supported by government largesse, even at the expense of, draining the entire eco base of certain areas. Where I live, Kevin O'Leary is going to open a data center in the desert that's double the size of, or it's the size of Manhattan, or larger than Manhattan, and uses double the power of our entire state. Which is, and we're the second driest state in the United States, which means that we might be the first driest state very soon.
Yeah, I mean, we've got it here in the Thames Valley, so the main kind of motorway corridor leading down to London. They've been opening up data centers, and there are already water shortages there. And the politicians who just keep rolling over and allowing it to happen. It's kind of they are extraordinary times. And I don't see. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think? Where do you think the AI bubble goes from here?
Well, the question is, does the United States and the Western powers broadly, are they willing to give up all their industrial capacity to attempt to invent God?
Yeah.
And so far it seems like yes, even though there's no evidence they're going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
But it really will. I mean, it is parasitic on it has been hard for Marxists to explain because it is parasitic on things that normally you wouldn't think the bourgeoisie would tolerate being parasitic on, which is property rights, which is commodity production, large tolerances of research costs that are not productive to capital. And what you seem to be seeing here is that there does seem to be some kind of acknowledgement or belief that capitalism as we've known it is reaching some kind of endpoint, but and I'm not a believer in techno-neo-feudalism or any of that. I've actually got specific reasons why I don't, but these actions only make sense if you assume that they don't think the current society and civilization survives. That does not mean that they think that all of humanity dies. I actually want to be clear on that. But
I think from their actions, we can see that they don't care if much of humanity dies. Like that's already happening.
No, they'll see it as a great winnowing, basically.
Yeah.
Which, in my darker moments, I used to argue with primitivists back when they were a political force to argue with. They're not anymore. They kind of went away. But one of the things I used to say to them was exactly this: is if what you predict about human population dynamics and resource use is true, and if it's obvious to you, it's obvious to the oligarchs, why do you think you're going to survive? Because you fetishize hunter-gatherers? Wouldn't the people who are now hoarding massive amounts of resources with their massive amounts of cash hoards, which aren't really the same as profits, but I'm not going to go into that. Wouldn't they be better positioned to survive such a winnowing? And I got no answer. And I think we're kind of seeing that, and in this weird way, these techno utopians are also weirdly like they buy into the logic of a lot of 90s primitivist arguments that we're going to have to reduce the world population, and they want to do it by attrition. How much they think it needs to be reduced is unclear, but dramatically. And I do think that does lead to a left that is fighting something that it's not used to fighting, which is a capitalism that is truly nihilistic in a different way than prior forms of capitalism.
I can see that. And what it doesn't know how to fight it, so therefore doesn't know what its argument is.
Right. And to be fair, I mean, a lot of the traditional arguments and justifications for capital, even used by this very regime and administration here just 2 years ago, have been dropped. Like the promise of jobs, the promise of reasonable pricing, all that stuff is going away. Like it's I wanted to get into this though, maybe to ask you though how this relates to anima, animus, and shadow integration, because weirdly I think it does.
Yeah.
Well,
I write about that, how Zuckerberg, do you remember sort of 18 months ago or so, he was talking about how companies and corporations needed more masculine energy. And which I talk about because, as we talked about at the start, there's this idea of kind of elderhood, or just being kind of having an understanding of yourself, comes from appreciating the male and female aspects of ourselves. And so I think that the way that these oligarchs are behaving, the way that Trump is behaving, destroying the forests and, whatever, just massive environmental destruction, a lack of care for the environment, and this kind of plowing forward is all very masculine. And I think it shows. Actually, I wrote an essay for Bram for Strange Exiles the other day about this, about how for his series on the crisis of masculinity, about how they, through their words and actions, they're all revealing a profound immaturity. They're behaving like teenage boys, and yeah. So from a Jungian perspective, I do think that shows a lack of integration of the anima, of this female aspect of ourselves that Jung says is there for all of us to discover.
I wanted to talk to you about the crisis of masculinity. I was watching some liberal mock, and of course, liberals like to mock things here. This seems to be their favorite pastime, and they don't. I think this is their own self-defense mechanism, because a lot of them are also relatively privileged and they just want to feel smart. But they were mocking the fact that men lost a lot of work in this economy, and then basically arguing that they deserve it because they won't take female roles. And I was like, look, I work as a teacher. Those roles aren't offered to them.
Yeah.
I was just like, okay, you're sure they can go into nursing. I mean, there's lots of want for male nurses, except that we just also cut our social health care stuff. So the only growth area of our economy is actually going to be flaming out by governmental policy in the next 2 years. I mean, I don't know how much you know about our healthcare system other than it's privatized, but it is still supported by the government at larger amounts than yours is. Even per capita, even adjusting for the difference in the size of our countries. And that is being gutted. And there's two political things for that. Is it's going to reclaim a lot of that boomer wealth that existed in the United States that you guys have in the UK, but not to the same extent. It's going to be sucked up in these healthcare debacles.
That boomer wealth actually is becoming a lot more visible in the UK.
Okay.
As it's becoming more visible as younger people's jobs become more precarious and less well paid, and as if you know about the triple lock in the UK, where the pension just keeps going up. It's just like the pension constantly ratchets up if you're a boomer, so their pensions are increasing as other people's wages are being depreciated.
Well, we would have had similar problems like that, but our medical system is sucking all that excess up.
Right.
But it's going to do that and crash out, because basically there's not the capacity for it. They're also trying to reduce the wages of nurses and whatnot, so they can't get anyone to do it. It's the insurance liabilities for non-specialist doctors are too high. We can't get anyone to do that either.
We're also going to see in the UK, we're going to see. So Wes Streeting, the health secretary who just stood down, he basically, his work had been done, that he's further privatized many aspects of the NHS, particularly in removing NICE, the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, which was the body that licensed all the medicines that went into the NHS. He's basically removed them now. So now it's a free-for-all from the pharmaceutical industry to be selling straight into the NHS.
Right.
So we're going to see NHS costs go through the roof.
I mean, so it seems like we're both sitting on with different time bombs, and it does tie into this masculinity crisis. But I do want to push, not back on you, but on this idea that this is just because like men need to be more inculcated into a female system. And I'm like, I even know liberals who, when they think of a male elementary school teacher, get uncomfortable because the social pushback on that is so significant, and it's just assumed that they're basically pedophiles.
Yeah,
and that is not something that just comes from the men themselves.
Yeah,
and I have thought about this in the way we talk about gender dynamics right now in general. There is a war on women's work right now, but also women's work is the women's work in quotation marks, but what the work traditionally care fields that are traditionally assigned to women more than men.
Yeah,
I happen to work in one of them and I like it. So, but nonetheless, it's also under attack, but it's the only area of growth at all in our country. Blue collar work, despite all the talk about the trades and all that, has been neoliberalized in some ways for the first time, because private equity is coming into it now, and treating it as a way to just extract more and more value for nothing, and burning a lot of people out. And the social safety net to deal with disability is being gutted too. But you have this irony of 1 in 3 men here don't have work, but we only have a 5% unemployment rate, which is, how does that happen? And you realize, these men are permanently out of work. They don't count in the unemployment calculations for our country anymore.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are on disability, or they're retired, but they cannot work.
Yeah.
And then you add to that large numbers of young people who don't count because they've never really been in work to be unemployed.
Yeah.
Like at all. I mean, the average age of entering a job was already up to 24 or 25 in this country, and now it's like there's no jobs for them, period.
Yeah.
It does seem like we've had the subjective crisis of masculinity for a while. Like the whole, like, going back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, stuff about men. But now I don't think it's just subjective. There's an objective crisis of masculinity, and that since 2007, the fields traditionally associated with men have been declining in the Western world. There has not been a whole lot of social safety net to handle it, particularly in the US. I mean, for as bad as things are in the UK, and they are quite bad, I'm not gonna put that down. You guys at least had something to fall from. Like, we never got most of that. And you're just wondering what's going to happen. And then you're also wondering, like, what does it mean in a society where, even though it's a small generation, you have Zoomer boys who are unemployed in large numbers, who also have access to guns. And I'm just like, as a social world, that's actually a little bit terrifying, historically speaking. And it does seem like our oligarchical elites just do not have an answer at all for how to deal with it.
Is there any discussion in the US on universal basic income?
Yes, actually there is, but it's mostly coming from the AI people. The problem that you have is they don't want to pin it to inflation, so it wouldn't be particularly meaningful. And there's no political basis to pass it through, even though you get this. I mean, even Elon Musk talks about, like, prosperity needing some kind of universal dividend. But so you're getting Musk doing that, but at the same time, he's gutting every social safety net we have. So what is this based off of? Like, they're just going to give you currency. Okay, well, that's great. If everything is inflating by 3 to 10% a year, that's not going to matter. So I don't know. I mean, it's also clear that there's a crisis of Western masculinity, in the sense that, like, normal productivity is even on a cultural scale. Like, if you look at the real value of GDP output, not measured in nominal currency, but measured in the ability to buy commodities, the United States has been in like significant decline for 7 years.
Yeah.
The UK has been in significant decline for a while.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably about that time scale as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, I feel like when I felt it personally because I used to. I for some reasons I tend to work for UK publishing houses, not US ones. I have no idea why. And it's always piecework. They would always pay me in like so many pounds per book. And at first I felt like, oh, I'm getting like $30 because it was like 10 pounds per book evaluation or whatever. Yeah. I'm getting like $30. And then later on, it's like, this is now worth $10.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my pay has not been lowered at all, but I get paid in pounds and this sucks. Although lately it's gotten a little bit better, not because your currency has gotten any better, but because ours has declined precipitously. So dollar value has been dropping. I mean, nominal dollar value was going up and up and up during the Biden administration in the first year of Trump, but now it's been So most Americans, however, don't know that or feel it. Like they don't. I mean, they feel it in inflation, but they don't feel it in. We don't deal with like currency exchange. I mean, we're a giant country. And almost everywhere it takes dollars. Well, at least they used to. So you don't feel it in the same way as you do now. And it's hidden from a lot of people. But I do think I wanted to ask you about I mean, initially it's what I want to talk about. And I read your book and I'm like, oh, we can tie it together. But like the crisis of masculinity, I do think liberals just kind of mock. Yeah. And I actually do think it's a real crisis that we don't have a good answer to. And it's not just subjective anymore. That might have just been a loss of privilege in the past. But I do think we haven't come up with any real ideals for like, what does a leftist man look like? What are their dreams? What is their hero's journey? How do they avoid burnout? Like, what is their narrative of normativity? And I don't think we're providing one right now.
No. And you get, yes, I mean, stepping into that void, you've got these kind of what's his name, clavicular and all those kind of looks maxing type of people,
which is literally like I was talking to Quinn, who's on This Is Revolution, and he's 25, and I was like, are you guys really that nihilistic that you're embracing masculinity in the kind of way that people have done with women for a long time, but in a way that's also actively and publicly killing yourself, like at a very young age, like taking the looks maxing in ways that it means taking tons of meth in your 20s and burning out and ending up recording yourself having a nearly fatal OD while also recording yourself micro fracturing your jaw.
Well, it's the same as you've just alluded to. It's the same trajectory as women in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same. It's a shift in the social positionality of the genders.
I was talking to a friend of mine who is a male academic, but a good feminist, and sometimes annoyingly so, to be quite honest. So just so you people know the type, but he was talking about he was noticing male students were aware of their gender roles and feeling the need to perform them, and he's like, well, that's a proof. And I was like, actually, it's not a proof of male dominance. If men were dominant clearly,
they wouldn't have to worry about that.
They wouldn't have to worry about performing the role. It would just be there. This to me seems like a real crisis of masculinity. And I'm not saying that we need to what's the stupid phrase in America here? We need a Joe Rogan of the left. And I'm like, every time I hear that, it makes me want to vomit.
Yeah.
But I do think we need an answer to what do you expect men to be? If they're what do you expect a leftist man to be? And And I don't mean that in a bioessential way. I don't care about like what role you have. And actually, studies of transgender men really make this obvious. Like the amount of change in social recognition that they often feel if you talk to a lot of transgender men about this. That they were oppressed and objectified when they were perceived as female-bodied, but now that they're perceived as men, they're just not perceived at all. And are only usually even brought up in the context of like detransition or something. That's usually in most of the dialogue in the States the only time you hear about them. And to me, that says a lot about like what we aren't doing. And I also agree, like you can go to leftist circles, particularly Marxist circles, and found a bunch of dudes who, except for having good politics on labor, would be unreconstructed chuds.
Yeah.
And I don't want that either. That's it's not like I want to make a politics that here's your chudness. And I do think, there was a popularity for a little while with Marxists just claiming that like toxic masculinity wasn't real. And I was like, no, dude, I have an honor complex, and I would, part of me wants to kill you when you look at me wrong. That is toxic.
Yeah.
Like, it's not socially helpful.
Yeah.
It may have been socially helpful, like, if I was in a highly hierarchical society and would like blah 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 blah, but I don't live in that society. I don't want to live in that society.
Yeah.
So this impulse I have of male competition and dominance and stuff, which I have. I'm like, I openly acknowledge it. Like,
so where do you think that comes from? As in, do you think that's something that you've learnt culturally?
I think it is. I have a complicated answer to that. I think some of the hormones are priming you for certain things. Like if you like testosterone increases aggression, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I do think it's how that manifests is totally culturally primed. And like, for example, I would say it's culturally primed, not just by national culture, but also like class culture and whatnot. Because as a person who now works in a white collar world but comes from a blue collar one, there are things that people who were raised in a white collar world that they'll say that I have to remind myself as someone coming from a blue collar world that I don't get to hit them with a baseball bat for saying it.
Yeah.
Like, because I was enculturated that certain kinds of slights should be responded to with violence. Particularly between men. Not, if a woman does it to you, I mean, and there's many sections. If a woman does it to you, women are weak, you just let it go. Like, and I was enculturated that way. I'm from a very particular time. I'm from a very reactionary culture, because even though I'm not Protestant, but I grew up in the deep south of the United States, which is culturally complicated because it has a history of defeat, but also defeat that it kind of deserved. And so like that plays into our psychology. It's very honor driven, very and that is cultural, because you meet other people even from the same country as me who don't have those same concerns. Then there's class concerns in it too. Like there's certain ways you show the ways you show love, slight, what is it the modern psychology uses, your love language. Well, love languages tend to be slightly classed, and stuff like that. And I think it is the view of people who have been downwardly mobile for a long time running into people who are downwardly mobile only recently. And I mean this in the sense that, like, from an objective standpoint in my world, I am two social classes on the liberal strata in terms of income from my parents. My mom was a waitress who became a nurse in her 40s.
Yeah.
And my father was my stepfather was a mechanic, and my father is a con artist.
Yeah.
And all but one of them have died relatively young, like in their 60s. I have a master's degree. I have like most of a terminal degree, but my income level is in, it's above 50%. It's above the median income. Not hugely above it, but it is above. And yet I couldn't replicate my parents' life. I couldn't buy the kind of house that they were able to buy. And so, even though I am upwardly mobile, I am still experiencing this as a downwardly mobile situation. And I'm encountering leftists who are downwardly mobile too. So there's often cultural classes there. And I do think this is partly cultural. I also think it is based off of models of masculinity that do not always help people. But as I've said before, we have to talk about then what we could do to help people. And just saying, like, I remember, I would hear stuff like all masculinity is toxic. And I'm like, I don't know how that helps you. I don't know how that helps,
Do you know what? This feels like it relates to when I was teaching. So I was teaching in high school for about 15 years, and I stopped teaching about 7 years ago. And we had I remember quite early on in my career, was teaching in this school in North London, and there was a working group was set up, which I joined because it just seemed so ridiculous. There was a working group was set up, which was about how to stop young boys engaging in risk-taking activities. And so these were like, I don't know what, like 13 to 16-year-old kids who were gambling, fighting, like doing the stuff that kids do. And I was the only person who was there saying this is happening because they don't have enough risk in their lives. Like they need to be given risk. Like they're doing this because and this is like my greatest pleasure was always taking kids out of London, taking them climbing mountains. I was a geography teacher, so that was kind of my bread and butter. And so I used to say, a lot of the kids who were having were seen as particularly problematic by the school, I'd often let them tag along on the next trip that I was doing, and they'd be great. Once we took them out and were doing stuff that was stretching them, and they were found challenging, they were great. And I wonder if there's something in that of like, you can't just deny masculinity, but how do people, how do men enact masculinity? You almost need to be sort of both modeling it and teaching people how to practice it.
Right. Which is why I find the liberal scorn around this to be so problematic, because I'm like, no, we need to be offering an alternative that's meaningful, that has them incorporate risk. I've had similar experiences. I haven't been able to take kids on field trips in forever. We don't really do that anymore. But when I taught at elite private schools, I took like a bunch of Egyptian kids into the Sahara, and there was a real chance that we could all die. It was not insignificant. Nobody did. We were all fine. But like, it was a learning experience and a way to be a mentor. That you don't see. And I've also talked a lot about this. Like you and I are, I'm gathering we're about the same age. I've taught for 20 years. I started teaching when I was 25 in college, and I started teaching high school when I was 27. So, and I'm also like you, an ex-academic. I still do. I guess I've tried to replicate the academic world without being in it for 20 years. Because it was a really bad experience for me. I mean, that's class too, but like
being in academia.
Yeah. I mean, I loved what I was told academia was.
Yeah.
But the actual politics of being in academia was
No.
bloodthirsty in a way that I used to be a corrections officer, aka a prison guard.
Yeah.
And I felt like we were less bloodthirsty than what academics are.
Yeah. Well, we had a thing a few years ago when I was still working as an academic. There was the UK Home Office, the government basically said that we had to start filling out forms every month for all of our foreign students to say like we'd seen them and stuff and all this kind of shit. Basically that we were to be border police. And we sat through this meeting, and these are all like academics who were, writing books on decolonization and like, and sat through this meeting with them, everyone just agreeing to do it. And I was the only person saying, well, like, what? Like, you're still, and yeah, it isn't. I mean, that's a different example, but yeah, certainly from my experience, academia doesn't do what it says on the tin.
Oh yeah, I had this issue, a similar thing, different motivation. I was sitting there with education academics, and we talk about equality all the time and educational equality, and this is the beginnings of what it was not yet called wokeness here, but it was gonna be.
Yeah.
And yet my boss, who was pushing all this and doing all these studies on social justice and education, was also deliberately recruiting from the richest neighborhoods in my state. Yeah. And I just couldn't square that. I was like, so all this is just talk. This is just the appearance of meritocratic fairness.
Yeah.
But it's, and as a person who came from a blue collar background, I was not prepped for them not to mean what they said.
Yeah.
Like, because, I heard all kinds of crazy shit come out of blue collar people in the Deep South, but they meant what they said.
Yeah. Well, my equivalent, I come from a very privileged background myself, but quite recently, both my kids have been diagnosed as autistic, which explains a lot for me. And I think my experience has been an autistic experience of thinking autistically that everyone always meant what they were saying. And
right.
Like what? Like yeah, exactly. Yeah. Similar dynamic.
This is actually quite funny. I'm with a neurodivergent person, but I have also specialized in working with autistic kids here for a long time. Yeah. And I really appreciate that about them. Because they do exactly what you ask them to.
Yeah.
And nothing else. So you have to think like, okay, if I assume a person doesn't understand all the, to use a Bakhtinian term, dialogic subtext of everything I'm saying.
Yeah.
How do I communicate? And it's been very good for me, actually, because I've learned in communicating with autistic kids, and I also obviously worked abroad, so I communicated with non-English speakers for a long time.
Yeah.
That you are just generally clearer.
Yeah.
When you assume that people will take you at your exact word.
Well, this is the thing. The accommodations that you make for neurodivergence are good for everyone.
Yeah, they absolutely are. The accommodations you make for most things are good for everyone. I mean, like my big frustration, for example, with the ADA is that it's not funded. I don't have a problem with the accommodations. I have a problem with the fact that we enforce them by lawsuit.
Yeah.
Which ironically for our country means the government's actually more exempted from meeting ADA expectations because the government's harder to sue. And so you have these little mom and pop stores, and look, I'm not here to pity the petite bourgeois, don't get me wrong, but I do think it's kind of ridiculous to expect small businesses that are run by people who probably have an income of $40,000 a year after expenses to try to be super accommodating with no help. when we could easily and not expensively use orders of scale to and help everybody meet the ADA. And and I said that to me, that's not even a Marxist point. That's not me making a point about like revolution. That's just like, this is how you run a society in a way that makes any fucking sense. And most accommodations really do work for people, but people resist that. And I think it's the same reason that you're talking about, that they don't. There's two things. One, they imagine that they're not going to benefit the accommodation in some kind of special treatment, which protects them, I think, from realizing that they are a bad day away from mental or physical collapse. As a person who recently broke my foot and was back on a cane for a while, I was like, yeah, this sucks.
But there's a related to that in certainly in the UK, and I wonder if I'd be interested to know if this same thing has happened in the US. But in the UK, particularly through Boris Johnson's government, the last Conservative government, anyone who, but it's now the standard that if you go against your government or go against your party, you're either excommunicated from the party or you're put on the back bench in Parliament. So you don't get to speak up, you don't get to say things. And there have been a few over the years in the UK. There have been a few politicians who have stood up for disabled rights, and they have tended to be people who've got a disabled family member. And so what happened under Boris Johnson is that anyone who spoke up would get backbenched or kicked out of government. And so that very, very small and weak protective characteristic of the parliamentary system has now been lost. So now, because the government so willfully just knock politicians out, we don't have that reality injection coming into Parliament anymore, which is kind of terrifying.
I suspect in the United States you'd have something similar, but it's harder to backbench because our parties are not as structured as your parties, frankly. I mean, they are structured, but they're like, it's like being backbenched in the United States will not actually end your political career if you play it right. But I still suspect the scale of politics here, like, we have like 600 representatives, so like even 100 with disabled family members, they can be shut up. Or they can be appeased with something very minor. I do think, as one of the things that we're having here is just the amount of physical damage on blue collar workers is becoming undeniable. Like 1 in 6 of them are on disability now and permanently can't work. And so just the strain on their bodies has to be dealt with. And that used to mean accommodations for other kinds of disabilities too. But they are chipping away at that as much as they can here.
I mean, because this goes back to the earlier point about kind of the desire to winnow away the population. Is it? I mean, are these people literally just being left to die? Like, is that?
Yes,
that's the plan.
If Idaho is an example, when they stopped using Medicaid to pay for patients for extreme schizophrenia by a state level mandate in Idaho, they have put that mandate back in because within a few weeks they had 5 deaths. So the politicians do freak out when they actually
they stop doing what?
They stop covering people with severe schizophrenia.
Wow.
With Medicaid.
Right.
So they just let them die. And they did. I mean, 5 of them died in 2 weeks. And like, they are reinstating some of the funding because they're horrified by like that being that blatant. Because if that happens in 2 weeks, think of what happens in a year or two. But that is the policies we are gearing towards. And I think we see that with COVID, actually. I mean, with COVID, we were willing to, in America, we lost 1 million people.
Yeah.
And
so
there
my experience with COVID was, I'd recently moved out. I live in a quaint thatched cottage in a village in Wiltshire, a few hours west of London now. But I was living in London for 20 years. And when I was last living in London, I was teaching in a school in Tower Hamlets, where the school I was teaching in was, we had the highest rate of free school meals in the country. So that's the highest rate of kids living in poverty in any school. And the school, the staff body of the school was kind of representative of the kids there. Like I was kind of one of those a few white teachers, but it certainly was not a privileged staff body. It was kind of representative of the kids there. And so when COVID hit, and everyone living out here in the countryside was kind of laughing about the restrictions, saying this is bullshit. I had 3 colleagues died in the first week of, like, in March when it first hit, and then, but still talking to people out here, privileged people living in the countryside, they're like, it was nothing. Like, they didn't know anyone that died, but because the people that I was working with, they all lived in multi-generational households where someone worked in the NHS, someone worked as a minicab driver. They got hammered by it immediately. So again, it's using that example of 1 million people dying in the US, and similarly, huge numbers of people died in the UK, and it was a disaster. But a lot of people, particularly people who are kind of talking about politics, engaged in politics, didn't see any of that.
I had a very torn. My experience of this was similar. I lost 2 family members. I almost lost my mother. She survived. She died from cancer 2 years later, but she survived her COVID attack. But I lost an uncle and a cousin.
Wow.
And they were in their 60s. And they were in multi-generational housing too. One of the things that I was pointing out to people, though, in the United States, the divisions are a little different. Living in the countryside does not actually equal not being impoverished. So
yeah. We still have rural poverty here. Like, it's not
okay.
Yeah.
I would actually, but it was strange because that was the biggest tell. Not even your income level was how close you were to a city.
Okay.
And I was actually trying to explain, and eventually it actually would burn through those rural communities too. It did eventually. But at first I was like, we need to talk to these people, realizing that their experience of COVID is going to be different than ours because their population densities are different. And like when you do, like, why are truckers, particularly bothered by COVID regulations? Well, let's be frank, they aren't actually that affected by them, except that they're possible carriers to the entire planet. But if you work mostly in a car, mostly by yourself, and you're not in a community for any long time, you probably don't experience this as a threat until you get it.
I was at the time, I was running I just set up it was quite good. It was a project at SOAS University, one of the universities of London, where we were teaching academics to, as well as, most academics will write their paper. They write their 40-page paper. It sits online, and they kind of, that's it, done for them. They then shuffle off looking at their shoes, and they don't want to talk to anyone again. And so I set up a project where we would teach those academics how to turn their paper into a 1-page brief, and then set up a comms strategy to get the briefing paper in front of politicians before debates. And so I just set this up just as COVID hit, which was kind of amazing, because it meant that we were able to, as everyone went online, we were able to step in, and we were getting briefing papers to politicians that they weren't getting briefed on otherwise. But one of the ones we sent in was just wrote a I can't remember who wrote it, but this briefing paper, which was comparing the COVID experience of the security guard in an office block to the office workers, and the security guard who has to keep. And this was based off the government statistics, the mortality statistics that they were publishing. But that person, the security guard versus the office worker, had I think he had a 12, or he or she had a 12 times greater risk of mortality from COVID as the person working in the office, who was immediately switching to working from home, wasn't having to go anywhere, etc.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that come up when I think about this, and maybe we can talk about the end of the book and about, like, your book kind of ends up using Jung to talk about what we might call acid leftism or acid communism.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you that I am of two minds of this. One, I have lost a lot of people on the left to addiction.
Yeah.
And this has been something that the two main, I mean, if I think about, like, colleagues of mine from Fisher to Michael Brooks was just a freak accident, but like, or a freak hemorrhage.
Yeah.
But in general, the two most common causes of death for leftists I know are either suicide or addiction related diseases.
Yeah.
And so I'm always very careful with substances, and also I struggled in my teens with addiction myself, and got out of it. But I will say, ironically, and this is where I want to talk about some of the stuff you talk about in your book that maybe leftists don't normally consider. I got off of my my substances cold turkey, and it was terrible and awful.
Yeah.
And even 7 years later, I was still having, like, cravings and flashbacks and whatnot. The biggest thing that helped was a psychedelic treatment.
Yeah.
Like, it really did. It was it's a treatment that I did not entirely legally on a brief trip to Europe where we were able to get ibogaine, and it caused a thorough enough disassociation that I had a break with cravings.
Yeah.
And it was
permanent break?
Yeah. It was gone.
Wow. Yeah.
Like, and so, you know, I have tried to replicate that by extreme feats of meditation. And it is, you know, you meditate, so you know this, but it's hard to describe this to people who don't.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, no, the brainwave changes do weird shit to you, and there are times where colors seem brighter, and you have weird, unexplained, like, experiences of deep joy. Also, occasionally, though, you have ego death, and you can feel like your personality completely splintered, and you don't know who you are anymore. And in those periods, you can also kind of go insane. But like, it is not without risk. I want to be very clear on that. And that's without any drugs. But I do think this is something that leftists should actually deal more with, and not seat. Right now, this is being seeded over to, like, Maha style right. And, you know, it's one of these things, like, I think our national healthcare apparatus is being destroyed by Robert Kennedy Jr. But every now and then, his crazy ass will say something like kind of fair and true, like, you know, maybe we should study psychedelic effects on addiction. And I'm like, shit, I agreed with Robert Kennedy. Like, and I kind of had that going reading your chapter about about this, and then the way that they adopted traditional culture. Like, I've read the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I have it over there. It's the way that like Metzer and Leary used it has nothing to do with the actual text, really. But
well, it's a I've got it up here somewhere as well. It's their book is it's kind of 3 pages from the translation that I've got that they've then elaborated.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a lot of Ram Dass, and I'm like you, I've noticed that when we were talking, reading your book, and I'm like, yeah, Ram Dass, like, will take a page of a 800-page ancient tome and like make an entire philosophy out of it, and I don't love that.
See, I'm a bit more open to that approach than I used to be, and I'll explain that with where I live at the moment. I live halfway between Stonehenge and Avebury, which is another massive Neolithic henge monument, and so we're kind of there's a weird kind of social
weird
divide.
Hippie druids.
Well, it's a weird social divide that we used to have Peter Mandelson living down the road from us, and it's kind of there's a lot of those type of people, and then there's the weird druid hippies. There's not really like they don't intermingle, and they're 2 very separate tribes, and so we go quite regularly to kind of solstices and equinoxes at Stonehenge, and go and chant along with the druids and stuff, and I used to be really cynical of druidry, because they've invented this whole religion from kind of half a sentence from some Roman historian, from Tacitus, and there's nothing there. There's no basis to it whatsoever. And then, particularly with
a few of them will even admit that. Actually, I kind of admire when they admit it.
No, they do admit it, and but then with my like ecotherapy work that I do now, where for myself, so I meditate at home, I meditate in this room I'm sitting in now, but I also spend a huge amount of time in the forest, and I spend enough time in the forest that stuff, like strange stuff, starts to happen. Mind emerges outside of me. And I spend enough time in the forest for that to happen for me, so that I can then help other people, help clients to experience that themselves. And I realized that actually some of the druids, people who claim to be druids, are, I don't know what they're doing, but some of them, when he speaks to them, this is what's happening, is that it's an emergent thing that's going on for them. And so I can't remember what your example was just then, but certainly for the druidry, I do now have a lot more time for it because I can see it. And this goes back to kind of Gnosticism as well, of that these things can be emergent from us.
Well, I'm of 2 minds of it. Part of me is a very strict historicist, and I'm like, well, you're not a druid. I'm not a druid.
Yeah.
I'm also not a Platonist. I'm not sure even if I'm a Marxist, even though I would call myself that, but I don't know that the context is exactly the same. And the same token, I have been a Shramana. I lived in a Vihara for a few months, and I have gone to live in monasteries for months at a time. Mainly because I've been very lucky and lived it where that was an experience you could do for like $100.
Yeah.
As long as you were contributing to the food fund, or you were a true monastic, they didn't care.
Yeah.
Whereas like if you try to do it in the United States, it's going to be inordinately expensive.
Yeah.
But and when I lived in the Vihara, I was actually temporarily homeless, and I just did work for them, and they were okay with that.
Yeah.
But most people don't get those experiences.
Yeah.
And you do kind of have to be very lucky if you're not rich. But it does help. I mean, like it does, like like I talk to people about PTSD and trauma culture, and I have been kind of sympathetic to some of the trends here in America where they're complaining about the overuse of trauma and leftist spaces and all.
Yeah.
And I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to that. But I am sort of like, but don't think the concept doesn't apply. If you've seen a lot, and we all have seen a lot more than we've used to see, and I think part of the problem with that, I'll give you an example. I have seen people like shot enough that I've had to clean blood off of my clothing.
Yeah.
But weirdly, the tactile experience of that is horrifying. But yeah, in experiencing it that way, you do have. It is such a visceral experience that you actually are processing it.
Yeah.
Whereas
you're physically processing it. Even you washing the blood out of your clothes is an act of processing.
Yeah, right. Whereas when Charlie Kirk was shot, and I want to be very specific, not because it's Charlie Kirk getting shot, but because it's at a school, UVU, which is a commuter school. It's not a major university, which I don't think people outside of even in the United States understood. Right. That is literally 35 minutes from my house, and I go there twice a year to take students to it, and I have stood at the exact spot that Kirk was shot. And I don't really give a shit about Charlie Kirk. I want to be very clear on that. But like watching that because of the context of me being there, but not being there, seeing it, was harder to process in some ways. Because
I can see that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are stuck in that position when it comes to trauma, where they're encountering things being shown to them that they can imagine themselves in. They know, like when it comes to Gaza, you've been around kids, you know what it's like to be around kids. You can't imagine watching a kid starve or be blown up.
Well, and actually, the same dynamic, psychological dynamic for me would be when I see in these kind of images coming out of Gaza, when I see kids who are the same age as my kids, I immediately break down.
Right. And it's like, child death is not something I think works the same way, but most people I know don't recover from it. But I do think it's very similar because you process this like another example for me when it came to contextualizing Gaza. I lived and worked in Egypt for 2 years, and one of the things is I taught a lot of people who either had family or were Palestinians or intermarried with Palestinians, and I taught two relatively privileged little girls who, and they were little, they were like 10 at this time, who had seen uncles and cousins killed in the silent Intifada. So this would have been this would have been in the very early teens. And it both contextualized it, but made it I like every time I see the shit on TikTok or whatever, when you get the atrocity exhibition coming out of Gaza. I think back about them, I have trouble processing it. Because like, even though I was with them and I could process it with them when I was there, now I'm like, well, okay, now there's all these kids and they're going to be like this kid that would just like occasionally break down, and how am I like, and I can't do shit about that. I'm not there. Like, and I do think we are going to need ways to cope with that. And
and just on a very simple level, archaically, like going back a long way, if you saw something like that happening, so go back 200 years or further, 500 years, go back 1,000 years, if you saw something horrific like that happening, the first thing you would do is run, or you'd fight, because it's a fight or flight. Your cortisol levels spike, and that activity burns your cortisol. So we're sitting watching this, and we're not responding in any way whatsoever. So we're not physically metabolizing what's happening to us. So there's that is immediately a problem. And then, as you say, that what just physiologically that's a problem. But also, as you say, like what do you do? And when we, again, these images are being beamed at us to solicit these responses. Like we can't do anything in the moment. Like there is nothing you can do in the moment. And so so I think in this, this is again, so back to the book, this is kind of getting to the core of why I wrote this book. It's like we've got to fucking figure out what to do. We need to know how to navigate this, because the ways that we have evolved aren't working right now. We now need to kind of need to sort of gain some agency in this, because we're not in the situation that our bodies have evolved to be in for these, to deal with the ways that our bodies are reacting physiologically is not evolved for the current situation.
Yeah. I think that's actually a good point. And even though a lot of what you and I are talking about here can sound like what I would call hippie shit, which can often go very reactionarily, admittedly, I do think that there are certain pathologies that you see amongst the highly political. I don't think it's just the left, although there are some that I would say are more acute on the left. But where you don't know how to deal with what you're seeing because you can't, you are also moving from a state of cortisol reactivity that, if it is acute and you can act on it, is even kind of good for you. But if it's chronic and you can't act on it, it literally destroys your system.
And actually, and this is actually something that happened to me. I basically had a massive midlife crisis because I got COVID. I had long COVID. I used to run. I'd run 100 kilometers a week, like quite obsessively. But I think what I was doing there, I was burning off all that cortisol all the time. And then I got long COVID and I couldn't run. I haven't been on a run for like 5 years now. And suddenly I wasn't burning all that cortisol off. Like suddenly the shit hit the fan and it was hard. So yeah, that was me finding a way that doesn't involve that exercise.
Yeah, similarly, I broke my foot recently, and I don't run. I've never been a runner, but I'm a lifter. But there's been periods where I couldn't, like, I got typhoid in Mexico, and I have colloidal scarring. So talk about my medical stuff, but like, I lost parts of organs and was like bedridden for 2 months, and then had another thing where I didn't eat solid food for like 7 months.
Wow.
And I was hard to deal with. And I think about that a lot when I talk about people, because one of the things your book is talking about is like burnout and activism, and I do think your use of Jung is helpful for that, in so much that you have to deal with the fact that, like, you can't ask people to put in time and time and time forever and not do any self-development, self-care, or whatever. It's not even good for the movement for you to do that.
I found for years I was amongst fellow leftists who were saying, like, stay angry, you've got to stay angry, and I really took that on board, and you just can't stay angry. It doesn't work. Like, our bodies don't cope with it, and also it doesn't achieve anything.꯫ You're not changing other people's minds from being angry.
I guess the last thing that I would think about is and I'm in agreement with you about the I'm an angry person, the last thing you want to tell me is to stay angry all the time, because
Yeah.
also eventually you attack the people who are nearest you.
Yes.
Because those are the people you can get.
Yeah.
Like, and that's not really helpful to leftists, to pro-social anything. Like,
and
I don't. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but I think the other, which you sort of alluded to before, but this problem of, and I think I'm sure it's on the right equally, in fact, but when I personally, and talking to other people about this, have got overwhelmed to the point of mental health crisis, it's normally because it's not because you're delusional. It's because you have such a clear understanding of reality of the political situation at the moment, and if you don't then have these kind of tools, whether they be Jungian or whatever other kind of hippie shit you want to bring in there, if you don't have tools to deal with your engagement with reality in that situation, then you're lost.
Have you ever read David Graeber and Marshall Sahlins' On Kings?
I've not read it. I know of it though.
All right.
Yeah.
That's where Graeber, and I don't always, I give Graeber a lot of shit, I'm not gonna lie, but but Graeber talks about like, and he doesn't do it in Jungian terms, but he might as well have. Talks about offsetting hierarchical tendencies by like creating hierarchical mythologies so you can actually live in a relatively equal life by like forming a mental king but distancing yourself from it, and like I think some of this is, you know, almost James Fraser like bad speculation, but some of it I have actually found useful for offsetting destructive or antisocial tendencies, and this is something that I actually do find Jungian psychology useful for, not, you know, the comparative mythology, and you write about Joseph Campbell, and while I find the hero's journey interesting, there are times where I'm like, yeah, but you know, I kind of think you're full of shit. Like I don't actually think all heroes work this way at all. But I do think that cylindrical understanding, symbolism is more important than just branding. And even leftists will sometimes think, oh, we're just doing these things for brands, or we're trying to represent these things. And I'm like, it's more important than that, because I think we cannot get out of the fact that both, I don't know if it's cultural or not. I'm not going to say it's inherently biological. I don't know. But I don't know of a culture that doesn't have symbols and whatnot that you use to understand both as ideological myths and as ways to channel your own psychic experience. And psychic, I just mean psychological. Towards that help deal with some of the stuff that you encounter. Which is why I have found a lot of this insistence on the left that we are like 19th century, almost mechanistic materialists to be honestly not even particularly scientific. Because I can't think of a healthy society on the planet that's ever operated that way. And I do think this is hard to get people to approach, and maybe like trying to reclaim parts of Jung as a way to get people towards it.
I mean, my last book was called Love and the Market, but the subtitle was How to Recover from the Enlightenment, and I do think that, I mean, all the Jung stuff came after that, but you can kind of see in my last book why I was heading towards that. I suppose the book How to Recover from the Enlightenment was kind of me kind of speculating on where to go next, and then it was kind of the Jung came in and filled the gap. But I think exactly as you've said, and pre-Reformation particularly, but pre-Enlightenment, pre-Reformation Europe, and almost any other society you care to find in the world, does have an appreciation of symbol and mythology and kind of some unexplained stuff. We need to there needs to be space for the unexplained stuff, and that, I think, from my personal experience, that tends to appear symbolically, and it's useful. Like, it's useful and it's important.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. Maybe I do want to ask you though. One of the things about Jungianism that is both a benefit and also a problem is the way in which it can give you ways to compare traditions that are really otherwise very different from each other through overlapping symbols, narrative patterns, narrative structures. Do you think that the left, by and large, for whatever reason, whether it's our Enlightenment rationality or our post-modern distrust of meta-narratives, or I think that was a bigger problem 20 years ago, but but whatever, because I do find some of these things inevitable, even in secular societies. Like, I will point out that, like, you like some of the communists I know, and I say this as a communist, but like, they talk like Protestants, with eschatology, and and they get really pissy when you point that out to them, and I'm just like, part of me is like, well, I think you should be aware of it, but the reason why you should be aware of it's not so you can excise it. It's just admit that that's what you're doing. And that it's in some ways unavoidable. Is that what you would advise people to do when they're like?
I think, I'd go further than that. I think there is a hugely puritanical tendency within the West, probably more pronounced in the UK and the US than other places, I would have thought.
English,
but I think we're incredibly puritanical, and I think, as you say, that's not necessarily to denounce that, but you need to be aware of what you're doing, which is kind of, again, which is the whole point of my book, is just, we need to increase our awareness of why we're acting in the ways that we do. And that's not to say that you necessarily change the course of action, but it's going to be helpful to be aware of that.
Right. Yeah, I think my big takeaway is, even if you're not religious, and whatever that means, which I can get on my big philosophy and sociology kick, where I'm like, the religion non-religion distinction is actually fake. But whatever.
Actually, this was my first book, which was about extremism, was the biggest point I was making, which was, as we had these, well, I was going to say conservative politicians, but politicians from across the board were promoting the idea of counter-extremism, which was based on the presumption that secularism is a neutral ideology, which is nonsense.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Although I would say our right is not as given towards secularism, but
not secular anymore.
No, although weirdly, they're also more secular than they've been in the past. It's that whole dynamic is quite interesting. Almost like
who believes what?
like we have all this promotion of religion and explicit call for Christian nationalism by people who are, some of whom are transparently not Christians.
Yeah, well, that was this big march in London today was a load of people shouting about Christianity who have probably never been to church in their life. Like, it's just mad.
That's
actually with my kind of work on counter-extremism was largely within that, the kind of activist circles around that, it was me working with predominantly Muslims, and also where I was teaching as well was predominantly Muslim kids and other teachers, and I've always felt really comfortable around Muslims in the UK, because you can't be a Muslim in the UK without and not know your positionality.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you were just a standard kind of white vague Christian wandering through life, you don't stop to consider that your positionality at all. So therefore, you can just presume that secularism is neutral or whatever else.
That's a good point. I always found it interesting after living in Egypt for a few years and spending a lot of time with like Salafist communities, how not political they were. I was like, wait, I thought you guys were Islamists, like, and I mean, they're like, yeah, but we're quietists, and I'm like, more of them were quietists than not. And I was like, well, then why do we give a shit? Like, just like, I don't understand why we care about this one way or the other. I mean, and me also, like, on certain things, the Salafists were even better. Like on stuff like female circumcision, they rejected it. Because it wasn't Quranic, it was cultural, and there wasn't any good hadith about it. And then I also realized Americans, they hear the word Sharia and they don't even know how hadith work. And I'm like, it's just, I don't know. Like I got a lot of explaining to do. Because this is not a religion that you can just declare belief and everything. Like, anyway, but I do find it interesting. The assumption of secularity has always fascinated me, because I, like you, have noticed that secularity is not only not neutral, it is very much shaped by the prior religious context. I've talked about, to be a secular American is to be an obnoxious Protestant somewhere deep down. And even if you don't have a Protestant background, and to be a secular Korean was to probably still had a whole lot of fucking Confucianism in your and some shamanism actually in your assumptions about the world. And I'm just like, there is no, like, as much as we might want it to be, there is no enlightenment neutrality to be found anywhere. And I don't even think it's scientific to pretend that there is. And that doesn't, I'm not saying everyone should go off and join a religion or whatever, but I am saying, like, we should take these things probably a little bit more seriously about why they exist, because no society has ever completely gotten rid of it. And even societies that tried to, they had to create dynamics that replicated it, like the Church of Reason, or some of the weirder practices about the New Year in the Soviet Union, or something like.
Well, Jung's point on religion is that he says he's not interested in God as such. He's interested in man's experience of God, and he goes on to say that God in this context is therefore a legitimate subject of scientific exploration, which I go for. But then I think the kind of the new ageism of Jung comes in, because he then makes the point that whether God as experienced is an evolutionary relic of the evolution of the human psyche, or is God as an external force, is we don't experience that in any different. There's no difference in differentiation in our experience of that, whether it's one or the other. And he says throughout his works, he's not interested in that question because it's unanswerable.
Which is fair enough. Like most. I am one of those obnoxious people who will tell people that you can't actually prove an anti-naturalist metaphysical assumption or a naturalist metaphysical assumption within a naturalist framework. You just can't do it. It's not like, it's not. the whole, I mean, like you can talk about the relative, like you can talk about relative versus not relative belief, and you can try to do your Russell's teapot thing, but the thing is everyone ends up with these unexamined experiences, dreams, metaphors, etc., that if you don't have a way to channel it, it can go in very, like, I don't know, I've just seen it go in very strange directions when actually people don't have a place. That's to me when like cult shits arise. That's when you get like political Islamism. That's, I mean, there are wild, I mean, people get very confused when I say modern evangelical Christianity in the United States is actually proof of the depth of secularization, of the depth, not depth of secularization, because it tries to replicate a Christian shitty version of everything secular, and B, they don't justify themselves on mythical or other terms. They actually adjust themselves on quite literalistic terms. It's not healthy for them to do.
That's interesting actually. They're not, which comes back to that point of not being aware of the symbolism in the world. It's back to Alex Jones, isn't it? Which we were sort of talking about. But I mean, I think one of the reasons I write, certainly my last couple of books, is to make sense of those strange, those kind of transrational experiences. So I spent, do you know the philosopher Roy Bhaskar, father of critical realism?
Critical realism,
So he, for his, one of his last books, The Philosophy of Meta-Reality, which is where he kind of goes into transcendental critical realism and kind of goes, he basically has his midlife crisis and starts talking about spirituality. And I ran a reading group at UCL for about a year to read that book, because it's kind of, it's so dense and impenetrable. It kind of, I don't know, it helped to have a reading group. And so we'd meet together once a month and read a chapter or whatever. And there's a lot in there about consciousness and the nature of consciousness. And it's quite sort of Hindu in its approach of kind of consciousness coming before materiality. And just after we'd finished that reading group, I was actually having a WhatsApp conversation with a friend, and it got into talking about the nature of consciousness. And I suddenly had a full kind of, I don't know, spiritual experience where materiality fell away and consciousness was there. And what was interesting for me there was that I basically, through intellectually going into that, I'd solicited the experience. And I've had other experiences of that with like getting more, when I started training in ecotherapy and nature connection, having kind of more shamanic experiences with animals and plants and stuff. And then similarly, then getting into Jung, and I start getting into Gnosticism, and I start, like I mentioned before about the bridal chamber, I start having Gnostic experiences. And so this comes back to that kind of this emergent spirituality or religiosity is, I find that interesting. And so it speaks to your point about where, you know, whether you're in Korea or the US or wherever, that secularism kind of births these other aspects. And I think, you know, what you just said about the evangelical right is really interesting, because they're, you know, they don't have the understanding to appreciate these potential, I don't know if that's exactly what you're saying, but in part manifestations of the psyche that they're experiencing, and therefore they end up doing terrible shit or proposing terrible shit. Whereas if they were able to kind of have better guidance and understanding of what was going on, then they might not be proposing such shit.
Yeah, I actually, one of my critiques of the Reformation, and not even the Enlightenment, so I guess, and I've been called a crypto reactionary for saying this, but that form of Protestantism eventually, because of its removal of like liturgical structures and structured consciousness and symbolism, renders belief into the purely ideological. I mean, particularly when you focus on belief itself, like they're really concerned about what you believe and not even what you do. And I think that weirdly is copacetic with what we might call ideological things in modernity, because it doesn't give you a whole lot of way to process things embodiedly. It's just something that you have to kind of process through either politics or through pure belief, and also somehow separating those two out. Which you can't really do. Go ahead.
There's a great book. Have you read the book The Sacking of the Altars?
No, I have not.
It's about the British Reformation. And I can't, if it might be up here in front of me. I can't see it. But anyway, it talks about, he tries to reconstruct what the church was like before the Reformation, the church in Britain was like before the Reformation. And I think it would be, he describes something that's far more like a kind of Hindu, like what you might see in India at the moment, where there are angels and demons, and I think my understanding of Jung was helped massively. My wife is Indian Malaysian, and so when we go to Malaysia, we spend quite a lot of time in the Hindu temple. And you go into the Hindu temple, and it's kind of all laid out for you, like all the different Vedic entities and stuff. I've experienced that. So it's I definitely find through, I'm not a Hindu by any stretch of the imagination, but going into the temple and seeing the different images and the stories and stuff is certainly, there are mental processes going on for me when I go into that space.
Yeah, I mean, I've had similar responses. I feel comfortable in most religious things except for Protestant churches because they feel weirdly blank.
Yeah.
It's just
yeah.
I mean, and honestly, Church of England is not the worst offender on that at all. Like like your Protestants are mild. Compared to some of ours. But it is interesting, growing up in that world, because I grew up around like primitive Baptists. Like snake handling was not out of my realm of knowing people who did that. So it is an interesting problem. And now I live in Utah, which you may know is not a theocracy, but it is. By an otherwise marginalized religion that doesn't really understand that the other Christians hate them, but they don't want them to hate. Yeah, it's just weird. Because recently there's been a push here to like teach the Bible, and I'm like, who's going to push back on you on that? All the not Mormons. Like, because they're not going to accept your reading of this Bible, I can promise you. And it's interesting how that matters, but I find Mormonism also interesting because it's somewhere in between the two spectrums. It's not. It still does have some liturgy, although not a lot. It's mostly Masonic and a little bit strange, but but then it's also very Protestant. If you've ever been to a Mormon temple, which most people haven't, but
I have not.
I have. It looks like a shopping mall,
right?
Like a very weird blank. Not even a shopping mall. It looks like the foyer to a shopping mall that has like one ancient font for baptism in it, and then everything else looks weirdly blank.
I have read it's up here somewhere. I've read the Book of Mormon. There you go. A friend of mine, Mike, gave it to me. Who is a Mormon, with his testament in it, and I don't know. I mean, it's great. Like they've still got a lot of magic in there.
Oh yeah, they do. They're weird quasi-scientific Gnostics in a lot of ways. They also have a very dialectical relationship to capitalism because they're the most capitalist church today, but at one point they were basically communist for real. But they were also
there. Is that just power corrupts?
Oh, it's part of it's power corrupts. Part of it is particularly the Smith and Young got more and more into profit making later on, particularly Brigham Young. But I will say part of it is when you enforce tithes to get into the afterlife, you tend to have a lot of money.
Right.
And so, I mean, the Mormon church is the second richest church on earth. And it might be the richest in terms of just cash. Because they require 10% of your gross income to even be kind of considered for temple marriage and whatnot, which you have to do to be a fully fulfilled Mormon. So yeah, I mean, part of it's corruption. Although they're also strange in that all evangelicals claim to do charity, and Mormons aren't evangelicals, but they actually do charity.
They do,
So like they do actually keep the poorest amongst them from starving and whatnot, which is not always true for everyone else. Although weirdly also, and this is something that'll shock my European, like, well, maybe not, I don't know. You can meet state block grant requirements for social services by Mormon charity.
Right.
And that was something that they got put in. So like, to get federal aid, the states have to do so much of their own spending on social welfare to get that welfare money. But the LDS Church and the Utah government got the state to consider religious spending as part of that equation.
Wow.
So there's this weird there's this weird way in which the U.S. is a more secular country than, like, formally than you guys are in Britain, but also not at all, because we even have religious stuff written into our laws for meeting social welfare needs. So, and I don't think even most Americans don't know that. Like, that's not something that's common knowledge. So, on that note, I think people should read your book. Where can people find your work, Rob?
So Radical Jung is out from Revol later this month. You can pre-order it now. So go to Revol or Google Radical Jung Revol. You'll find it. Just look out. I think there'll be. You can sign up to Revol Substack. I've got an essay coming out next week. I think what's the essay? The essay next week is following on from this talk, acid extremism now.
I've actually found your work from the Revo Substack. I scandalously have not written for it because maybe my tendencies to talk as opposed to write, Daredevil will get a kick out of that, but are strong. But yeah, I think people should go find you on the Revo stuff. You also work a lot with, like, Strange Exiles, right? With Bram over there, which is tied into Revo. But
I've written a couple of essays for him.
But people should check out your work. I find it interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to chat.
All right. Nice chat. Have a good evening. It's late there, so
I'm gonna get to bed now.
All right.
What are you doing?